Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be looking at The Heart of William James, edited by Robert Richardson. And this is a collection of essays by William James. We've seen this type of book before as we work our way through William James's philosophy. This book has a very important essay in it, one that actually was not in any of the other compilations that I've reviewed so far. But luckily it is in this one, so I'm going to focus on that essay today. And it's actually one of his most important essays. It's called Philosophical Conceptions and Practical Results. But that's not the only essay I'm going to talk about. I want to mention a little bit of a lecture, The Gospel of Relaxation. So the last time I talked about William James was Talks to Teachers, not that many episodes ago. And Talks to Teachers had a section that I didn't cover called Talks to Students, the latter maybe third of the book or so. And I promised to put that off for another day. And today is the day that I will dip into it a little bit, and then I will get into some more of the Talks to Students in another episode, but I'll at least touch on this one essay here, The Gospel of Relaxation. William James was really interested in these three essays, or it was three lectures that comprised his Talks to Students. Two of those lectures, the other two, on a certain blindness in human beings and what makes a life significant, those two sort of go together. And they also do mesh with this one, the Gospel of Relaxation. They all kind of go together, but those other two are really designed to go together, and the second one speaks specifically about what was spoken about in the first one. So I'll leave those two for their own episode, but this first one, the Gospel of Relaxation, I'll cover, and then I'll dive a little deeper into this very important essay, Philosophical Conceptions and Practical Results. All this stuff came out in 1899, and it was all lectures. The Gospel of Relaxation was a lecture that he gave, I think, multiple times when he was doing his Talks to Students lecture series, and the other one was a singular lecture that he gave in Berkeley, and it was a big deal. It introduced pragmatism. It kind of pinned it down, defined it to the academic world. And he had been fairly well known at that time. By 1899, he was really in his prime. He had put out the Principles of Psychology back in 1890, the shortened version of that in 1892. Will to Believe came out in 1897. He had a lot of successful essays. All of his books were successful. His lecture series were successful. His tour of talking to teachers, his tour talking to students. And he was just very well known. And then he delivered this really powerful and important speech in Berkeley in 1899. So 1899 was a good year for him. He released this Gospel of Relaxation, although I think he had been delivering it before 1899, but published in 1899. And the Gospel of Relaxation is kind of self-explanatory. This is his introductory essay and Talks to Students. He's just telling people to sort of stay, how to stay in a good frame of mind, not to get too worked up about things, and it's kind of like a little bit like generic self-help. This isn't his best essay, but there's a little bit in here that I like and want to speak to. Like in all my episodes, I'm going to read a few sections here. And this first section I want to read is about healthiness and having a healthy mind. And he says, quote, "A Viennese neurologist of considerable reputation has recently written about the Binnenleben, as he terms it, or buried life of human beings. No doctor, this writer says, can get into really profitable relations with a nervous patient until he gets some sense of what the patient's Binnenleben is, of the sort of unuttered inner atmosphere in which his consciousness dwells alone with the secrets of its prison house. This interpersonal tone is what we can't communicate or describe accurately to others. But the wraith and ghost of it, so to speak, are often what our friends and intimates feel as our most characteristic quality. In the unhealthy minded, apart from all sorts of old regrets, ambitions checked by shames and aspirations obstructed by timidities, it consists mainly of bodily discomforts, not disdainfully localized by the sufferer, but breeding a general self-mistrust and sense that things are not as they should be with him. Half the thirst for alcohol that exists in the world exists simply because alcohol acts as a temporary anesthetic and effacer to all these morbid feelings that never ought to be in a human being at all. In the healthy-minded, on the contrary, there are no fears or shames to discover, and the sensations that pour in from the organism only help to swell the general vital sense of security and readiness for anything that may turn up. Consider, for example, the effects of a well-toned motor apparatus, nervous and muscular, on our general personal self-consciousness, the sense of elasticity and the efficiency that results. They tell us that in Norway, the life of the women has lately been entirely revolutionized by the new order of muscular feelings with which the use of the ski or long snowshoes as a sport for both sexes has made the women acquainted. 15 years ago, the Norwegian women were even more than the women of our lands votaries of the old-fashioned ideal of femininity, the domestic angel, the gentle and refining influence sort of thing. Now these sedentary fireside tabby-cats of Norway have been trained, they say, by the snowshoes into lithe and audacious creatures, for whom no night is too dark or height too giddy, and who are not only saying goodbye to the traditional feminine pallor and delicacy of constitution, but actually taking the lead in every educational and social reform. I cannot but think that the tennis and tramping and skating habits and the bicycle craze which are so rapidly extending among our dear sisters and daughters in this country are also going to lead to a sounder and heartier moral tone, which will send its tonic breath through all our American life. I hope that here in America more and more the ideal of the well-trained and vigorous body will be maintained neck by neck with that of the well-trained and vigorous mind, as the two co-equal halves of the higher education for men and women alike. The strength of the British Empire lies in the strength of character of the individual Englishman. Take it all alone by himself, and that strength, I am persuaded, is perennially nourished and kept up by nothing as much as the national worship in which all classes meet of athletic outdoor life and sport. I recollect years ago reading a certain work by an American doctor on hygiene and the laws of life and the type of future humanity. I have forgotten its author's name and its title, but I remember well an awful prophecy that it contained about the future of our muscular system. Human perfection, the writer said, means ability to cope with the environment, but the environment will more and more require mental power from us and less will ask for bare brute strength. Wars will cease, machines will do all our heavy work. Man will become more and more a mere director of nature's energies, and less an exerter of energy of his own account. So that if the Homo sapiens of the future can only digest his food and think, what need will he have of well-developed muscles at all? And why, pursued this writer, should we not even now be satisfied with a more delicate and intellectual type of beauty than that which pleased our ancestors? Nay, I have heard a fanciful friend make a still farther advance in this new man direction. With our future food, he says, itself prepared in liquid form from the chemical elements of the atmosphere, pepsinated or half digested in advance, and sucked up through a glass tube from a tin can. What need shall we have of teeth, or stomachs even? They may go along with our muscles and our physical courage, whilst challenging ever more and more our proper admiration will grow the gigantic domes of our crania, arching over our spectacled eyes, and animating our flexible little lips, to those floods of learned and ingenious talk which will constitute our most congenial occupation. I am sure that your flesh creeps at this apocalyptic vision. Mine certainly did so, and I cannot believe that our muscular vigor will ever be a superfluity. Even if the day ever dawns in which it will not be needed for fighting the old heavy battles against nature, it will still always be needed to furnish the background of sanity, serenity, and cheerfulness to life, to give moral elasticity to our disposition, to round off the wiry edge of our fretfulness and make us good-humored and easy of approach. Weakness is too apt to be what the doctors call irritable weakness, and that blessed internal peace and confidence, that acquiescentia incepso, as Spinoza used to call it, that wells up from every part of the body of a muscularly well-trained human being and soaks the indwelling soul of him with satisfaction, is, quite apart from every consideration of its mechanical utility, an element of spiritual hygiene of supreme significance. End quote. So there you have William James in his eminently interesting writing style, talking about the women of Norway taking up skiing, and how this is 1890s, and how all the new habits of bicycle riding among women are so interesting to him, and he thinks refining them. And he talks about how education should be a balance of physical sport, physical activity, and physical training, and mental activity and training. Which I just think this is really interesting. You know, we do oftentimes sort of sort ourselves into the thinkers and the brutes, and it's probably better if you have a bit of each, some sort of sport activity that you engage in to keep yourself fit if you're a thinker, and definitely some books to read if you're a more physical type. So, in the future vision of people just thinking and not being physical, depending on machines to do everything, turning into withered little pathetic weak beings with massive brains, huge crania. I could just picture that. I think we've seen that in some sci-fi here and there. But he's a really interesting writer. Moving on a bit to a later part in this essay, he talks about how emotions can block and impede your ideas, which is interesting. He says, quote, "If one's example of easy and calm ways is to be effectively contagious, one feels by instinct that the less voluntarily one aims at getting imitated, the more unconscious one keeps in the matter, the more likely one is to succeed. Become the imitable thing, and you may then discharge your mind of all responsibility for the imitation. The laws of social nature will take care of that result." Now, the psychological principle on which this precept reposes is a law of very deep and widespread importance in the conduct of our lives, and at the same time a law which we Americans most grievously neglect. Stated technically, the law is this: that strong feeling about one's self tends to arrest the free association of one's objective ideas and motor processes. We get the extreme example of this in the mental disease called melancholia. A melancholic patient is filled through and through with intensely painful emotion about himself. He is threatened, he is guilty, he is doomed, he is annihilated, he is lost. His mind is fixed, as if in a cramp, on these feelings of his own situation. And in all the books on insanity you may read that the usual varied flow of his thoughts has ceased. His associative processes, to use the technical phrase, are inhibited, and his ideas stand stock still, shut up to their one monotonous function of reiterating inwardly the fact of the man's desperate estate. And this inhibitive influence is not due to the mere fact that his emotion is painful. Joyous emotions about the self also stop the association of our ideas. A saint in ecstasy is as motionless and irresponsive and one-ideaed as a melancholic. And without going as far as ecstatic saints, we know how in everyone a great or sudden pleasure may paralyze the flow of thought. Ask young people returning from a party or a spectacle, all excited about it, what it was. "Oh, it was fine, it was fine, it was fine," is all the information you are likely to receive until the excitement has calmed down. Probably every one of my hearers has been made temporarily half idiotic by some great success or piece of good fortune. Good, good, good is all we can at such times say to ourselves until we smile at our own very foolishness. Now, from all this we can draw an extremely practical conclusion. If, namely, we wish our trains of ideation and volition to be copious and varied and effective, we must form the habit of freeing them from the inhibitive influence of reflection upon them, of egoistic preoccupation about their results. Such a habit, like other habits, can be formed. Prudence and duty and self-regard, emotions of ambition and emotions of anxiety have, of course, a needful part to play in our lives, but confine them, as far as possible, to the occasions when you are making your general resolutions and deciding on your plans of campaign, and keep them out of the details. When once a decision is reached and execution is the order of the day, dismiss, absolutely, all responsibility and care about the outcome. Unclamp, in a word, your intellectual and practical machinery, and let it run free. And the service it will do you will be twice as good. Who are the scholars who get rattled in the recitation room? Those who think of the possibilities of failure and feel the great importance of the act. Who are those who recite well? Often those who are most indifferent. Their ideas reel themselves out of their memory of their own accord. Why do we hear the complaint that so often that social life in New England is either less rich and expressive or more fatiguing than it is in some other parts of the world? To what is the fact, if fact it be, due, unless to the overactive conscience of the people, afraid of either saying something too trivial and obvious, or something insincere, or something unworthy of one's interlocutor, or something in some way or other not adequate to the occasion? How can conversation possibly steer itself through such a sea of responsibilities and inhibitions as this? On the other hand, conversation does flourish and society is refreshing, and neither dull on the one hand nor exhausting from its effort on the other, wherever people forget their scruples and take the brakes off their hearts, and let their tongues wag as automatically and irresponsibly as they will. End quote. So that's cool. I like that. He's talks about the melancholic and the saint are both just as blocked up with ability to think. It's like almost like a strong emotion just takes over your brain and your cognitive capacity diminishes. And the more emotional if you're emotional all the time, then your cognitive capacity is probably diminished all the time. And so he's talking about, don't worry so much all the time. You can do what you can here and there to keep emotion and worry and concern about things from impeding you. Like he says, who's the better lecturer? The person who's always worried about the outcome of their lecture, or the person who seems like they're indifferent about it and they just let the ideas roll off their tongue. They let the ideas do the work. And they're almost just a sort of participant, but they're not worried about it all the time. The more professors who are more constantly worried about the qualities of their lectures are usually not lecturing as well. So anyway, that's pretty interesting. That's all I'm going to cover from the Talks to Youngsters. A couple of pieces of life advice: stay healthy and don't worry, man. Let's move on to the other essay here, Philosophical Conceptions and Practical Results, this very important essay that William James gave in Berkeley to deliver pragmatism to the world. And he talks about James Peirce. He gives credit to James Peirce. And here he says, quote, "I feel that there is a center in truth's forest where I've never been. To track it out and get there is the secret spring of all my poor life's philosophic efforts. At moments I almost strike into the final valley. There is a gleam of the end, a sense of certainty. But always there comes still another ridge. So my blazes merely circle toward the true direction. And always now, if ever, would be the fit occasion, yet I cannot take you to the wondrous hidden spot today. Tomorrow it must be, or tomorrow. And pretty surely death will overtake me ere the promise is fulfilled. Of such postponed achievements do the lives of all philosophers consist. Truth's fullness is elusive. Ever not quite. So we fall back on the preliminary blazes, a few formulas, a few technical conceptions, a few verbal pointers, which at least define the initial direction of the trail. And that, to my sorrow, is all that I can do here at Berkeley today. Inconclusive I must be, and merely suggestive, though I will try to be as little technical as I can. I will seek to define with you merely what seems to be the most likely direction in which to start upon the trail of truth. Years ago, this direction was given to me by an American philosopher whose home is in the East, and whose published works, few as they are and scattered in periodicals, are no fit expression of his powers. I refer to Mr. Charles S. Peirce, with whose very existence as a philosopher I dare say many of you are unacquainted. He is one of the most original of contemporary thinkers, and the principle of practicalism, or pragmatism, as he called it, when I first heard him enunciate it at Cambridge in the early 70s, is the clue or compass by following which I find myself more and more confirmed in believing we may keep our feet upon the proper trail. Peirce's principle, as we may call it, may be expressed in a variety of ways, all of them very simple. In the Popular Science Monthly for January 1878, he introduces it as follows. The soul and meaning of thought, he says, can never be made to direct itself toward anything but the production of belief. Belief being the demi-cadence which closes a musical phrase in the symphony of our intellectual life. Thought, in movement, has thus for its only possible motive the attainment of thought at rest. But when our thought about an object has found its rest, in belief, then our action on the subject can firmly and safely begin. Beliefs, in short, are really rules for action, and that the whole function of thinking is but one step in the production of habits and action. If there were any part of a thought that made no difference in the thought's practical consequences, then that part would be no proper element of the thought's significance. Thus the same thought may be clad in different words, but if the different words suggest no different conduct, then they are mere outer accretions and have no part in the thought's meaning. If, however, they determine conduct differently, they are essential elements of the significance. Please open the door and veuillez ouvrir la puerte in French mean just the same thing, but damn you, open the door, although in English means something very different. Thus, to develop a thought's meaning, we need only determine what conduct it is fitted to produce. That conduct is for us its sole significance. And the tangible fact, at the root of all our thought distinctions, however subtle, is that there is no one of them so fine as to consist in anything but a possible difference of practice. To attain perfect clearness in our thoughts on an object, then, we need only consider what effects of a conceivably practical kind the object may involve, what sensations we are to expect from it, and what reactions we must prepare. Our conception of these effects, then, is for us the whole of our conception of the object, so far as that conception has positive significance at all. This is the principle of Peirce, the principle of pragmatism. I think myself that it should be expressed more broadly than Mr. Peirce expresses it. The ultimate test for us of what a truth means is indeed the conduct it dictates or inspires. But it inspires that conduct because it first foretells some particular turn to our experience which shall call for just that conduct from us. And I should prefer for our purposes this evening to express Peirce's principle by saying that the effective meaning of any philosophic proposition can always be brought down to some particular consequence in our future practical experience, whether active or passive, the point lying rather in the fact that the experience must be particular than that it must be active. End quote. Okay, so this is a super important part of American philosophy right here. When William James talks about Charles Peirce and Peirce's principle of pragmatism. And he talks about how the entirety of what you can know about an object is what consequences you can expect from it. And he says, to attain perfect clearness in our thoughts of an object, we need only consider what effects of a conceivably practical kind the object may involve. what sensations we are to expect from it. So I think that's interesting because he talks about the consequence of an object, including the sensations that you are able to expect that you will receive from it. Now, that comes back to like experiencing something is not necessarily what we would commonly consider acting. We're passively receiving sensations, but it remains a consequence of the object. So it's not just a question of how something will affect your conduct, how something will cause you to act, by which you should, regard it. But the consequences writ large of a thing, which I suppose is somewhat obvious, but it is important here how he talks about how the soul and meaning of thought can never be made to direct itself toward anything but the production of belief. So you think in order to believe things, like the demi-cadence, which closes a musical phrase in the symphony of our intellectual life, is the belief. The thought is this process, and its aim is always to settle itself in belief. Once it believes, it stops thinking. Right? He says, thought and movement has for its only possible motive the attainment of thought at rest. Your mind is trying to come to a closure and end the thought with a belief. But the belief then begins the new process of acting, and the belief is a rule of conduct and a motive to act based on a belief, or a motive to act in a certain manner based on belief. Your beliefs are the underpinnings of your habits and of your code of conduct. He says, if there were any part of a thought that made no difference in the thought's practical consequences. Now, sure, that could consider sensations as well as a practical consequence, but a belief as a code of conduct and a rule of action and a rule of habit creation that doesn't have the capacity to affect those actions or habits is as meaningless of a belief as a component of thought that doesn't lead itself to the completion of a belief. Of course, then William James takes it to philosophy and says what we really can think about here in this lecture hall is the consequences of a philosophy. The entirety of a philosophy can be known by its consequences. Anyhow, moving to the next section, he talks a bit about belief in God. And this is something that comes up periodically in William James. Much of his dedication to pragmatism is bound up with his desire to believe in God. And I think that belief in God was challenged by the things that he was studying. And for that reason, it became of extra importance to him that he find a way to justify believing in God in the face of what he had learned. He says, quote, "If we start off with an impossible case, we shall perhaps all the more clearly see the use and scope of our principle. Let us therefore put ourselves in imagination in a position from which no forecasts of consequence, no dictates of conduct can possibly be made, so that the principle of pragmatism finds no field of application. Let us, assume that the present moment is the absolutely last moment of the world, with a bare non-entity beyond it, and no hereafter for either experience or conduct. Now I say that, in that case, there would be no sense whatever in some of our most urgent and envenomed philosophical and religious debates. The question, is matter the producer of all things, or is a God there too, would, for example, offer a perfectly idle and insignificant alternative, if the world were finished, and no more of it to come. Many of us, most of us, I think, now feel as if a terrible coldness and deadness would come over the world, were we forced to believe that no informing spirit or purpose had to do with it, but it merely accidentally had come. The actually experienced details of fact might be the same on either hypothesis, some sad, some joyous, some rational, some odd and grotesque. But without a God behind them, we think they would have something ghastly. They would tell no genuine story. There would be no speculation in those eyes that they do glare with. With the God on the other side, they would grow solid, warm, and altogether full of real significance. But I say that such an alternation of feelings, reasonable enough in a consciousness that is prospective, as ours now is, and whose world is partly yet to come, would be absolutely senseless and irrational in a purely retrospective consciousness, summing up a world already past. For such a consciousness, no emotional interest could attach to the alternative. The problem would be purely intellectual, and if unaided matter could, with any scientific plausibility, be shown to cipher out the actual facts, then not the faintest shadow ought to cloud the mind of regret for the God that by the same ciphering would prove needless and disappear from our belief. For just consider the case sincerely, and say what would be the worth of such a God if he were there, with his work accomplished, and his world run down. He would be worth no more than just that world was worth. To that amount of result, with its mixed merits and defects, his creative power could attain but go no farther. And since there is to be no future, since the whole value and meaning of the world has been already paid in and actualized in the feelings that went with it in the passing, and now can go with it in the endings, since it draws no supplemental significance, such as our real world draws, from its function of preparing something yet to come, why then, by it we take God's measure, as it were. He is the being who could once for all do that, and for that much we are thankful to him, but for nothing more. But now, on the contrary hypothesis, namely, that the bits of matter following their laws could make that world and do no less, should we not be just as thankful to them? Wherein should we suffer loss then, if we dropped God as an hypothesis and made the matter alone responsible? Where would the special deadness, crassness, and ghastliness come in? And how, experience being what it is once for all, would God's presence in it make it any more living, any richer in our sight? Candidly, it is impossible to give any answer to this question. The actually experienced world is supposed to be the same in its details on either hypothesis, the same for our praise or blame, as Browning says. It stands there indefeasibly, a gift which can't be taken back. Calling matter the cause of it retracts no single one of the items that have made it up, nor does calling God the cause augment them. They are the God or the atoms, respectively, of just that and no other world. The God, if there, has been doing just what atoms could do, appearing in the character of atoms, so to speak, and earning such gratitude as is due the atoms, and no more. If his presence lends no different turn or issue to the performance, it surely can lend it no increase of dignity. Nor would indignity come to it were he absent, and did the atoms remain the only actors on the stage. When a play is once over and the curtain down, you really make it no better by claiming an illustrious genius for its author, just as you make it no worse by calling him a common hack. Thus, if no future detail of experience or conduct is to be deduced from our hypothesis, the debate between materialism and theism becomes quite idle and insignificant. Matter and God, in that event, mean exactly the same thing, the power, namely, neither more nor less, that can make just this mixed, imperfect, yet completed world. And the wise man is he who in such case would turn his back on such a supererogatory discussion. Accordingly, most men instinctively, and a large class of men, the so-called positivists or scientists, deliberately do turn their backs on philosophical disputes, from which nothing in the line of definite future consequences can be seen to follow. The verbal and empty character of our studies is surely a reproach with which you of the Philosophical Union are but too sadly familiar. An escaped Berkeley student said to me at Harvard the other day, he had never been in the philosophical department here, Words, words, words are all that you philosophers care for. We philosophers think it all unjust, and yet, if the principle of pragmatism be true, it is a perfectly sound reproach, unless the metaphysical alternatives under discussion can be shown to have alternative practical outcomes, however delicate and distant these may be. The common man and the scientist can discover no such outcomes, and if the metaphysician can discern none either, the common man and scientist certainly are in the right of it, as against him. His science is then but pompous trifling, and the endowment of a professorship for such would be something really absurd. End quote. So I like that section, the kind of reproach of philosophers that, if it's said that your philosophy is meaningless, it has no practical impact in the world, maybe it's true. Maybe if there is according to pragmatism, there really is no point to quibbling over things that have no consequence. And he says paying people to do this is actually quite absurd if all of this has no meaning. But he starts it off with simply saying that if you were to imagine that now is the last moment, that the universe is done right now, boom, and there's nothing more, what difference would it make whether God exists or not? He says if you're just looking at the world in its completeness, and God is a part of that, or God is not a part of that, but there's nothing more, it's full and complete, then the question of whether God is part of it or God is not part of it becomes a sort of meaningless question. It doesn't make it any better or any worse either way. Of course, he continues from there to say, the philosophy is not meaningless, and we don't live in a world in which we're only looking backwards at a frozen universe that has nothing more to come, but we live in a world in which the future is always unfolding, and in a world, in that sort of world in which the future is still unfolding, the question of whether there is a God or is not a God becomes a more meaningful one, because it has potential different consequences for us, we think. It might mean something to us one way or the other, in a way that it wouldn't mean anything, it wouldn't have any consequence if everything was over and done with. And he brings up Herbert Spencer, with whom he had an ongoing dispute. I don't know as though they wrote letters to each other in disagreement, but they disagreed about some fundamental things. And I wish that William James had not had this dispute with Spencer. I wish he had just taken maybe some of Spencer's ideas and perfected them a little bit, maybe made them better, or in some way had taken in some ideas from Spencer rather than just dismissing him. Spencer allows for more of a deterministic world, and I think that William James could maybe not. It's not his temper, but I think he could use a little bit more determinism and a little bit less insistence on a free will against all odds. Anyway, as he talks about Spencer here, he says, quote, "In every genuine metaphysical debate, some practical issue, however remote, is really involved. To realize this, revert with me to the question of materialism or theism. Place yourself in this time in the real world we live in, the world that has a future, that is yet uncompleted whilst we speak. In this unfinished world, the alternative of materialism or theism is intensely practical, and it is worthwhile for us to spend some minutes in our hour in seeing how truly this is the case. How indeed does the program differ for us, according as we consider that the facts of experience up to date are purposeless configurations of atoms moving according to eternal elementary laws, or that on the other hand they are due to the providence of God. As far as the past facts go, indeed there is no difference. These facts are bagged, are captured, and the good that's in them is gained, be the atoms, or be the God their cause. There are, accordingly, many materialists about us today who, ignoring altogether the future and practical aspects of the question, seek to eliminate the odium attached to the word materialist, and even to eliminate the word itself by showing that, if matter could give birth to all these gains, why then matter, functionally considered, is just as divine an entity as God, in fact coalesces with God, is what you mean by God. Cease, these persons advise us, to use either of these terms with their outgrown opposition. Use terms free of the clerical connotations, on the one hand, of the suggestion of grossness, coarseness, ignobility on the other. Talk of the primal mystery, or the unknowable energy, or the one and only power, instead of saying either God or matter. This is the course to which Mr. Spencer urges us at the end of the first volume of his Psychology. In some well-written pages, he there shows us that a matter so infinitely subtle and performing motions as inconceivably quick and fine as modern science postulates in her explanations has no trace of grossness left. He shows that the conception of spirit, as we mortals hitherto have framed it, is itself too gross to cover the exquisite complexity of nature's facts. Both terms, he says, are but symbols, pointing to that one unknowable reality in which their oppositions cease. Throughout these remarks of Mr. Spencer, eloquent and even noble in a certain sense as they are, he seems to think that the dislike of the ordinary man to materialism comes from a purely aesthetic disdain of matter, as something gross in itself and vile and despicable. Undoubtedly, such an aesthetic disdain of matter has played a part in philosophic history, but it forms no part whatever of intelligent modern man's dislikes. Give him a matter bound forever by its laws to lead our world nearer and nearer to perfection, and any rational man will worship that matter as readily as Mr. Spencer worships his own so-called unknowable power. It not only has made for righteousness up to date, but it will make for righteousness forever. And that is all we need. Doing practically all that a God can do. It is equivalent to God. Its function is a God's function, and is exerted in a world in which a God would be superfluous. From such a world, a God could never lawfully be missed. But is the matter by which Mr. Spencer's process of cosmic evolution is carried on any such principle of never-ending perfection as this? Indeed, it is not. For the future end of every cosmically evolved thing or system of things is tragedy, and Mr. Spencer, in confining himself to the aesthetic and ignoring the practical side of the controversy, has really contributed nothing serious to its relief. End quote. He doesn't agree. Spencer sounds like he's advocating for a sort of pantheism, and saying basically that if matter is responsible for all of the things that we see and experience, everything in the world, from the most amazing to the most basic, is only and completely the product of matter, then isn't matter just as amazing of a creative force as God is in God's creation? Is somehow the universe less amazing? And so Spencer sort of postulates a different way of viewing reality. I guess matter, I haven't read Spencer, so it's hard to say, but viewing matter / reality / nature as a sort of quasi-deity, a spiritual force of some sort that has a destiny to move toward a more and more complex or more and more beautiful or more and more great destiny. So some of Herbert Spencer's ideas are kind of weird, and maybe they should be, rightly pushed back against. But I also think there's a pantheism that is a pretty practically useful belief system that doesn't require some of the some of the beliefs that underpin monotheism, the historical beliefs that underpin it. The way that we experience monotheism and belief in God is not just, this singular belief, God exists, that's the beginning and the end of it. There's a whole lot of other stuff that go along with it that is not going to, ultimately conform with what we continue to learn about the nature of the material universe. So belief, all these other things get kind of chipped away, and all that's left after they've all been, abandoned is just belief in God. James does believe in evolution, but he doesn't take the kind of materialistic / pantheistic spiritual consequences of that belief system in the same way that Spencer does. James doesn't really seem to do an awful lot to address this, although certainly there's more to be read about religion from James. He just sort of puts it down to this simple binary question of God exists or God doesn't exist. That's not really a reflection of what goes along with believing in God for most people. It's a sort of, I don't know if like New Age would even be the right way to define it, but anyway, moving on from there, he says, quote, "Apply now our principle of practical results and see what a vital significance the question of materialism or theism immediately acquires. Theism and materialism, so indifferent when taken retrospectively, point, when we take them prospectively, to wholly different practical consequences, to opposite outlooks of experience. For, according to the theory of mechanical evolution, the laws of redistribution of matter and motion, though they are certainly to thank for all the good hours which our organisms have ever yielded us, and for all the ideals which our minds now frame, are yet fatally certain to undo their work again, and to redissolve everything that they have once evolved. You all know the picture of the last foreseeable state of the dead universe, as evolutionary science has put it forth. I cannot state it better than in Mr. Balford's words. The energies of our system will decay, the glory of the sun will be dimmed, and the earth, tideless and inert, will no longer tolerate the race which has for a moment disturbed its solitude. Man will go down into the pit, and all his thoughts will perish. The uneasy consciousness which in this obscure corner has for a brief space broken the contented silence of the universe will be at rest. Matter will know itself no longer. Imperishable monuments and immortal deeds, death itself, and love stronger than death, will be as if they had not been. Nor will anything that is be better or worse, for all that labor, genius, devotion, and suffering of man have striven through countless ages to effect." That is the sting of it, that in the vast driftings of the cosmic weather, though many a jeweled shore appear, and many an enchanted cloud-bank floats away, long lingering ere it be dissolved, even as our world now lingers, for our joy, yet when these transient products are gone, nothing, absolutely nothing, remains to represent these particular qualities, these elements of preciousness, which they may have enshrined. Dead and gone are they, gone utterly from the very sphere and room of being, without an echo, without a memory, without an influence on aught that may come after, to make it care for similar ideals. This utter, final wreck and tragedy is of the essence of scientific materialism as at present understood. The lower, and not the higher, forces are the eternal forces, or the last surviving forces within the only cycle of evolution which we can definitely see. Mr. Spencer believes this as much as anyone. So why should he argue with us as if we were making silly aesthetic objections to the grossness of matter and motion, the principles of his philosophy, when what really dismays us in it is the disconsolateness of its ulterior practical results. No, the true objection to materialism is not positive but negative. It would be farcical at this day to make complaint of it for what it is, for grossness. Grossness is what grossness does. We now know that. We make complaint of it, on the contrary, for what it is not a permanent warrant for our more ideal interests, not a fulfiller of our remotest hopes. The notion of God, on the other hand, however inferior it may be in clearness to those mathematical notions so current in mechanical philosophy, has at least this practical superiority over them, that it guarantees an ideal order that shall be permanently preserved. A world with a God in it, to say the last word, may indeed burn up or freeze, but we then think of him as still mindful of the old ideals and sure to bring them elsewhere to fruition, or that where he is, tragedy is only provisional and partial, and shipwreck and dissolution not the absolutely final things. This need of an eternal moral order is one of the deepest needs of our breast, and those poets, like Dante and Wordsworth, who live on the conviction of such an order, owe to that fact the extraordinarily tonic and consoling power of their verse. Here, then, in these different and emotional practical appeals, in these adjustments of our concrete attitudes of hope and expectation, and all the delicate consequences which their differences entail, lie the real meanings of materialism and theism, not in hair-splitting abstractions about matter's inner essence, or about the metaphysical attributes of God. Materialism means simply the denial that the moral order is eternal, and the cutting off of the ultimate hopes. Theism means the affirmation of an eternal moral order and the letting loose of hope. Surely here is an issue genuine enough for anyone who feels it, and as long as men are men, it will yield matter for serious philosophical debate. Concerning this question, at any rate, the positivists and pooh-poohers of metaphysics are in the wrong. End quote. So there he affirms that it really comes down to the consequences, and he talks about how cold and dead the world will be once the universe winds down, its all of its kinetic energy is dissipated, and it ends in a sort of entropic stillness. And how everything that we believe, all of our ideals, all of our hopes and dreams as people, as a species, as living things, ultimately doesn't mean anything at all in the big picture, at the end of things. It's all just meaningless. Whereas a universe with a God is a world in which, in some way, the things that we cared about are related to things that may live on after the end of the universe. Sort of the eternalness of the things that we care about the most, and the ideas of good and evil and things of that sort actually have some greater meaning than just pointless material matter. And I don't know, it seems like if that's just, there's just something after the whole universe comes to its close, there's something that continues on, is really like the desire to be able to touch infinity, the desire to have some relationship with something that doesn't end. The idea of it all just ending is, I think, scary to people and disappointing to people. If there's a God that carries on our ideas and our hopes and dreams and our beliefs in his memory, perhaps somehow we can live forever if God remembers us. But the idea is what disposition it puts people into when they believe one thing or the other, when they believe that the world ends in one way or another. How does it make them behave differently? What impact does it have on their beliefs, and how do the beliefs, the varying beliefs in God or materialism, how do those beliefs impact the people's actions? And his idea here is that, and he talked about in Will to Believe, there are certain questions that are like up for debate and certain questions that are not up for debate. And something has to have certain qualities for it to be like, a question that that people can kind of decide one way or the other. Some questions you can't just jump in and just decide on your own will what the case is. It's certainly something to think about. I don't think I agree with his concept of the consequences of these various beliefs, but I can see where he's coming from. I can understand why he makes that point. Anyway, one more section to read here where he talks about monism and pluralism along these same lines. He says, quote, "The question whether the world is at bottom one or many is a typical metaphysical question. Long has it raged. In its crudest form, is an exquisite example of the loggerheads of metaphysics. I say it is one great fact," Parmenides and Spinoza exclaim. "I say it is many little facts," reply the atomists and associationists. "I say it is both one and many in one," say the Hegelians. And in the ordinary popular discussions we rarely get beyond the barren reiteration by the disputants of their pet adjectives of number. But is it not first of all clear that when we take such an adjective as one absolutely and abstractly, its meaning is so vague and empty that it makes no difference whether we affirm or deny it? Certainly this universe is not the mere number one, and yet you can number it one, if you like, in talking about it as contrasted with other possible worlds, numbered 2 and 3 for the occasion. What exact thing do you practically mean by one when you call the universe one, is the first question you must ask. In what ways does the oneness come home to your personal life? By what difference does it express itself in your experience? How can you act differently towards a universe which is one? Inquired into in this way, the unity might grow clear and be affirmed in some ways and denied in others, and so cleared up, even though a certain vague and worshipful portentousness might disappear from the notion of it in the process. For instance, one practical result that follows when we have one thing to handle is that we can pass from one part of it to another without letting go of the thing. In this sense, oneness must be partly denied and partly affirmed of our universe. Physically, we can pass continuously in various manners from one part of it to another part. But logically and psychically, the passage seems less easy, for there is no obvious transition from one mind to another, or from minds to physical things. You have to step off and get on again, so that in these ways the world is not one, as measured by that practical test. Another practical meaning of oneness is susceptibility of collection. A collection is one, though the things that compose it be many. Now, can we practically collect the universe? Physically, of course, we cannot, and mentally we cannot, if we take it concretely in its details. But if we take it summarily and abstractly, then we collect it mentally whenever we refer to it, even as I do now when I fling the term universe at it, and so seem to leave a mental ring around it. It is plain, however, that such abstract noetic unity, as one might call it, is practically an extremely insignificant thing. Again, oneness may mean generic sameness, so that you can treat all parts of the collection by one rule and get the same results. It is evident that in this sense the oneness of our world is incomplete, for in spite of much generic sameness in its elements and items, they still remain of many irreducible kinds. You can't pass by mere logic all over the field of it. Its elements have, however, an affinity or commensurability with each other, are not wholly irrelevant, but can be compared and fit together after certain fashions. This again might practically mean that they were one in origin, and that tracing them backwards we should find them arising in a single primal causal fact. Such unity of origin would have definite practical consequences, would have them for our scientific life at least. I can only give these hasty, superficial indications of what I mean when I say that it tends to clear up the quarrel between monism and pluralism, to subject the notion of unity to such practical tests. On the other hand, it does but perpetuate strife and misunderstanding to continue talking of it in an absolute mystical way. I have little doubt myself that this old quarrel might be completely smoothed out to the satisfaction of all claimants, if only the maxim of Peirce were methodically followed here. The current monism, on the whole, still keeps talking in too abstract a way. It says the world must be either pure disconnectedness, no universe at all, or absolute unity. It insists that there is no stopping place halfway. Any connection whatever, says this monism, is only possible if there be still more connection, until at last we are driven to admit the absolutely total connection required. But this absolutely total connection either means nothing, is the mere word one spelt long, or else it means the sum of all the partial connections that can possibly be conceived. I believe that when we thus attack the question and set ourselves to search for these possible connections, and conceive each in a definite practical way, the dispute is already in a fair way to be settled, beyond the chance of misunderstanding, by a compromise in which the many and the one both get their lawful rights. End quote. So it does kind of seem like a bit of a ridiculous philosophical dispute. Of course, the world is one in some ways and many in other ways. As I've said in the past, I tend to think that the practical impact of our interactions with the environment are such that interacting with the world as if it were many is kind of the default order. There are things around you. There are different people who are interacted with in different ways. There are different things you do. And you're always interacting with many things. There's a multiplicity constantly bombarding us. And the oneness of the world is something that requires a bit of contemplation. And so there's a sort of priority to the manyness of things. But as a determinist, I don't think that the world is entirely separate, a collection of separate things. The connectedness of things is what allows for determinism to exist as a way of understanding the world. Everything has to be connected through a network of cause and effect and physical laws. So those are the main important sections here. He subjects a few different things, a few different ideas, monism and pluralism and God and materialism, subjects them to the question of what practical impact comes about as a result of various beliefs. And that's really the principle of Peirce. What are the consequences of your idea? And this comes right back to, some politically conservative ideas where it doesn't really matter what an ideology's intention has good intentions, intends to make everybody's life better, like communism intends to make everyone's life better. It doesn't matter what it intends to do, or if its intentions are selfish, if the free market is built on selfishness. The intentions that drive the actions are of less concern than the consequences, the practical impact of a philosophy, a political philosophy, an economic system. What are the results that unfold when you take a certain philosophy to be the truth? So that will wrap it up for today. Thanks a lot for listening. I'll talk to you again next time.